Two black teens get pulled over while driving alone. Minutes later, the cop shuts down the entire street. What he saw in their back seat changed everything. The Alabama sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt as 16-year-old twins Kane and Jared Holloway drove their uncle's aging SUV down Highway 98. The air inside the vehicle was tense, silent except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the old radio. Kane's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. Jared sat in the passenger seat, eyes darting between his phone and the road ahead. They were supposed to be home. They weren't even legally allowed to drive this far on their own. But this wasn't just another rebellious teenage joyride. In the back seat, buckled tightly and surrounded by ice packs, sat a medical transport cooler. It was labeled in bright red, urgent, organ for transplant. Earlier that day, the boys had overheard the doctor at St. Mark's Hospital saying that the courier bringing a donor liver for their mother, Laurel Holloway, had gotten stuck hours away in Mississippi due to a highway pileup. Their mom was dying. Her liver was shutting down fast. And unless she got the organ within hours, she wouldn't make it through the night. So the twins made a decision most adults wouldn't dare. They borrowed their late uncle's car, technically inherited, though still not legally theirs, and drove over 80 miles to meet the stalled courier in a gas station parking lot outside Biloxi. The man, desperate and relieved, handed over the container without hesitation. Now they were speeding back toward Mobile, doing their best to obey speed limits while their hearts raced. Neither spoke much. They didn't have to. They knew what was at stake. Every second mattered. But someone else didn't know that. As they passed through a quiet neighborhood just 5 miles from the hospital, red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. Kane's stomach dropped. Jared cursed under his breath. A police cruiser was following them. The siren blared. Kane pulled over quickly and calmly. He turned off the engine, placed his hands on the dashboard, and whispered, "Stay cool. No sudden moves." The SUV was registered, the organ marked and packed properly, and they weren't doing anything wrong, except being two young black teenagers driving alone with a cooler full of something no one would believe without context. As the footsteps of the approaching officer echoed on the pavement, Jared's voice cracked in the silence. "Do you think they'll believe us?" Kane didn't answer. He wasn't sure either. Officer Barton Cribbs approached the vehicle with the kind of caution that had been drilled into him over 20 years on the force. One hand rested lightly on his holster while the other held a flashlight, its beam slicing through the evening shadows. The SUV's windows were tinted, but not illegally so. Still, something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He glanced at the plate, ran it through dispatch. Registered to a Terrence Holloway. Local. No outstanding issues. But when the driver's window slowly rolled down, Barton's posture stiffened. Two young black teens stared up at him. The driver looked calm, too calm. That alone was enough to trigger his suspicion. In his experience, calm meant practiced, and practiced often meant trouble. "License and registration," he said, his voice firm. The boy behind the wheel, Kane, reached slowly into the glove compartment. "Yes, sir," he replied, deliberately keeping his movements visible. Jared sat frozen, hands still on the dashboard. Barton took the documents, glancing over them as his flashlight beam flicked across the interior. It was when he passed over the back seat that something made him pause. There, sitting upright and securely strapped in, was a large white cooler with red markings. The words, "Tissue Transport, Urgent," jumped out at him, along with a hospital barcode. "What's that?" Barton asked, narrowing his eyes. "It's an organ." "A liver," Jared said quickly. "For our mom. She's at St. Mark's. She doesn't have much time." Barton squinted at them. "You expect me to believe two teenagers are transporting a human organ?" Kane, still calm but visibly on edge, nodded. "Yes, sir. The original courier couldn't get through. There was a wreck on I-10. We had to go get it ourselves or she'd die. Step out of the vehicle, Barton ordered. The boys obeyed, moving slowly, their body language careful not to provoke. Barton opened the back door and examined the container. The cooler was cold to the touch, labeled properly, even had a chain of custody slip tucked under the strap with signatures and times. It looked authentic. He radioed dispatch. "This is Unit 42. I've got a civilian vehicle with what appears to be a medical-grade organ transport unit, en route to St. Mark's. Request immediate verification of transplant logistics and possible police escort." There was a pause on the line, then static, then confirmed. St. Mark's reported a failed courier delivery earlier this evening. Organ was rerouted manually. Sounds like you found it. Barton's tone shifted. How much time do they have? Less than 40 minutes, the voice on the radio replied. That was all he needed to hear. Barton snapped into action, slamming the door shut and gesturing for the boys to get in his cruiser. Leave the car. I'm getting you there. Now. He grabbed the cooler and placed it in the front seat beside him. Kane and Jared scrambled into the back. As he flipped on his lights and peeled away from the curb, Barton keyed into his radio again. All units, lock down eastbound lanes to St. Mark's. I've got a liver for emergency transplant on board. This is not a drill. For the first time in their lives, Kane and Jared saw a cop drive like his life depended on it, because now, it did. Officer Barton Cribbs gripped the wheel with steady urgency as his cruiser tore down the near-empty streets, lights flashing, siren piercing the air in rhythmic bursts. Inside, the city was waking up to what was unfolding. Barton's radio crackled with voices, units acknowledging his call, intersections being cleared, traffic diverted. But in the back seat, time felt still. Kane stared out the window, his chest rising and falling quickly. Jared leaned forward, clutching the headrest in front of him. "Officer, do you think she'll make it?" he asked, voice low and shaking. Barton didn't look back. "I don't know. But we're going to give her the best damn chance we can." The organ cooler sat buckled in the front passenger seat like a third officer. Its presence was unnerving. Barton had seen plenty of strange things on duty, drug busts gone wrong, hostage calls, even a bank robbery once, but never had he transported something so vital, so literal in its weight and consequence. He toggled the radio again. Unit 42 approaching intersection of Maple and 12th, need full closure, ETA to hospital, 7 minutes. Copy that, 42. You have green lights all the way in. Emergency crews standing by. Just 3 hours ago, Barton had been sitting in his cruiser sipping gas station coffee, wondering how much longer he could do this job. He'd grown tired of the tension, of walking into situations where everyone expected the worst from him because of the badge on his chest. And then, this. He glanced over at the cooler. He'd doubted them. Instinctively. Without a shred of benefit of the doubt. 2 teenage boys, black, alone in an SUV late at night with medical equipment. He'd almost drawn his weapon. That thought made his stomach knot. "Why didn't you call for help?" he asked, breaking the silence. "We tried," Kane answered. "The transplant coordinator's phone was busy. The hospital line just kept putting us on hold. We didn't have time. You realize what you did was dangerous." Jared spoke now, louder than before. "And letting our mom die wasn't." Barton looked at them through the rearview mirror. He saw not defiance in their faces, but conviction, resolve. And fear. A fear he understood more than he wanted to admit. They passed through the final light before the hospital zone. 2 officers stood at the intersection waving them through, cars frozen behind barricades. People on sidewalks looked confused, some raising phones to film. A few even clapped when they realized it was an escort, not a chase. The hospital appeared ahead, its rooftop helipad glowing, our entrance swarmed with medical staff in gowns and gloves. "Hang on," Barton said, pressing the accelerator. He pulled to the curb with a screech. Two nurses ran forward, opening the passenger door, lifting the cooler carefully into a rolling cart. A surgeon, still tying on gloves, shouted to one of them, "Vitals. Cooler temp stable. Organs viable," one nurse confirmed. Another doctor looked back at the cruiser. "You the courier?" Barton shook his head and gestured to the back seat. "No. They are." The doctor looked stunned for a second, then simply nodded. "Get them inside. If the mother pulls through, it'll be because of these kids." The brothers followed the medical team into the ER, wide-eyed and trembling. Barton stood at the doors, not moving, watching them disappear into the fluorescent light. He took off his cap, exhaled deeply, and for the first time in years, prayed. The sliding doors to the ER closed behind Kane and Jared with a sharp hiss, sealing them inside a world that moved with relentless precision. Nurses in scrubs buzzed past, their words clipped and urgent. A gurney rolled by carrying a trauma patient, blood staining the sheets. The boys stood out, two teenage figures frozen in a storm of motion, their clothes dusty, their faces pale. A nurse named Lisbeth, no older than 30, stopped and placed a hand on Kane's shoulder. "You boys brought the donor organ, right? For Laurel Holloway?" Jared nodded quickly, almost afraid to speak. "She's our mom," Kane added. "Please, tell us she's still alive." Lisbeth's face softened. "She's hanging on. Barely. But we've got the liver now. That gives her a fighting chance. Come with me." She led them to a small family waiting room, quiet and dimly lit, tucked between the trauma bays and the surgical wing. There was a vending machine, a worn-out couch, and a TV that no one had turned on in hours. As they sat, the adrenaline started to wear off. Jared slumped in his seat, head resting against the wall. Kane's legs shook uncontrollably. Minutes passed like molasses. Through a glass panel, they could see the OR corridor down the hall. Surgeons had already taken their mother into surgery. The last they saw of her was a brief glimpse as she was wheeled past, unconscious, pale, her face sunken. She didn't even look like herself anymore. A doctor in scrubs eventually entered, holding a clipboard, surgical cap hanging loosely around his neck. His name tag read, "Dr. Neville's, Transplant Surgery." He looked at the boys, and though his face was tired, there was a weight in his eyes that demanded honesty. "First off, what you two did, it was reckless. It was dangerous. You could have been arrested or worse." Jared opened his mouth, but Neville's raised a hand. "But," he added, "your mother would be dead if you hadn't." He sat across from them and sighed. "She has a rare liver disease, autoimmune hepatitis, complicated by sepsis. Her system is crashing. This transplant is her only hope. We have the donor liver prepped and it's a compatible match." "That's the good news." "The bad?" Kane asked, barely above a whisper. "She's incredibly weak. Her blood pressure is low. There's a high chance of rejection, and complications could arise during anesthesia. I won't sugarcoat this, it's a coin toss." The boys said nothing. Kane stared at the floor. Jared clenched his fists. Dr. Neville stood. "We'll do everything we can. You gave her that chance. Now it's on us." And then he was gone, swept back into the world of surgical masks and cold steel tools. The waiting stretched into hours. Each tick of the clock felt louder, heavier. Occasionally a nurse would come in with an update, still stable, still in surgery, no signs of rejection yet. Those brief words kept hope alive. Sometime after midnight, Officer Barton Cribbs quietly entered the room. He had gone to change out of uniform but wore the same somber expression. He didn't say anything at first, just took a seat across from them. I told dispatch what happened, he finally said. Told them everything. You won't be in any legal trouble. If anyone tries, they'll answer to me. Kane blinked hard, then nodded slowly. Barton continued, his voice lower now. I almost pulled my gun when I saw you. My instinct told me you were a threat. That instinct was wrong. And I'm sorry. Jared looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, you helped save her too. The three of them sat in silence, the night pressing in on all sides. Just before dawn, the doors finally opened. Dr. Neville's reappeared, his gown stained, his face exhausted. He smiled. She made it. The liver took. She's stable. No one moved for a second. Then Kane covered his face and sobbed. Jared collapsed forward, forehead on his knees. Barton just closed his eyes and whispered, thank God. The storm had passed. Their mother was alive. And the world, just for a moment, felt like it had righted itself. The sun had barely risen when Kane and Jared were finally allowed into the ICU. The hallway was hushed, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the low murmur of nurses exchanging quiet updates. Everything felt surreal, like the hospital had slipped into a slower, sacred rhythm now that the emergency had passed. Their mother lay in a narrow bed, pale but alive. Tubes ran from her arms. Monitors blinked steadily. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with the oxygen supply. Her eyes were closed, but her face had color again. It was the first time in days the boys had seen her look anything close to peaceful. Kane stepped closer, fighting tears. He took her hand, cold but warm enough to tell him she was still here. Jared stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed tightly over his chest, like holding himself together by force. She's really breathing, Jared whispered. On her own. A nurse quietly entered behind them. She may wake up in the next few hours. She's going to be groggy, disoriented, but she'll know you. And she'll know what you did for her. Kane turned. Did they tell her yet? The nurse shook her head. We thought it would be better coming from you. They sat in the ICU for almost 2 hours before Laurel's eyes fluttered open. The world around her was a blur of sterile light and muffled sound, but the moment her gaze found her son's, clarity broke through. Kane. Jared. Her voice was no more than a whisper. They jumped to her side. Yeah, Mom, Kane said, his voice cracking. We're right here. She tried to speak again, but her throat was dry. A nurse appeared with a sponge and water. Laurel looked around, then down at the 4 in her hand, the monitors, the hospital gown. Her brows furrowed. The liver, she murmured. You got it, Jared said softly. You made it, Mom. You're gonna be okay. Tears slipped down her cheeks. How? Kane took a deep breath. The courier got stuck. We found out and, we drove out and brought it back ourselves. Laurel stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief, then turned to Jared. You drove, across the state. With? Yeah, he said. And we got stopped by a cop. But he helped us. Laurel began to cry in earnest now. She squeezed Kane's hand and whispered through broken sobs, you shouldn't have risked so much. You're just kids. We couldn't let you die, Kane replied. We didn't have a choice. Later that day, news of the twins' daring act began to spread. Hospital staff told the story to their supervisors, who shared it with local reporters. A journalist from the Mobile Tribune showed up just after noon, requesting an interview. The boys declined, too exhausted to speak, but Barton Cribbs gave a statement in their place. They didn't do this for attention, he said. They did it because they love their mother more than they fear the world. By evening, word had spread even further. A regional TV crew sent a cameraman. Comments flooded the hospital's social media. Donations began pouring in, people moved by the bravery of two teens who did what most adults wouldn't dare. But inside the hospital, away from cameras and applause, Kane and Jared sat quietly beside their mother's bed. They weren't thinking about praise. They weren't thinking about the media. They were watching the slow, steady rhythm of her breath. For the first time in days, they knew she would live. And that was more than enough. 2 days after the surgery, the world outside St. Mark's Hospital was buzzing with the story of the Holloway twins. But inside room 417, the atmosphere remained sacred, calm, warm, and slow, like the beating of a healing heart. Laurel Holloway was improving faster than expected. Though still weak, her vitals were strong. The new liver was holding. Her voice returned to more than a whisper, and so did her smile. The hospital had allowed Kane and Jared to stay in a small family room on the same floor, but they rarely left her side. Nurses brought in extra chairs, and the boys took shifts napping beside her bed. Every time Laurel woke, one of them was there, either adjusting her blanket, reading to her from her favorite worn novel, or simply holding her hand. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Nevels entered with a tablet and a calm expression. He ran through her labs and vital stats. "You're progressing remarkably," he said, scrolling. "I want to be cautious, but if things continue like this, you could be out of ICU by Friday." Laurel smiled faintly. "I guess stubbornness runs in the family." Dr. Nevels chuckled. "You're here because of a miracle, and 2 sons who refuse to let you go." After he left, Laurel turned to her boys, her expression soft and unreadable. "I need to say something," she said, her voice steadier now. "I haven't been the best mother lately. Working 2 jobs, always tired, always worried. I know I've been distant." "Mom, stop," Kane started, but she raised her hand. "Let me finish. I tried to protect you from the world, from how unfair and cruel it can be. I never wanted you to be the ones doing the saving. But you did. You put everything on the line for me, and I can't ever repay that." Jared leaned in. "We weren't trying to be heroes. We were just scared. And angry. They told us help wasn't coming. So we became the help." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't deserve sons like you." "Then maybe," Kane said gently, "you raised us better than you think." That afternoon, Officer Barton Cribbs returned, not in uniform, but in a plain gray button-down and jeans. He knocked lightly on the doorframe before entering. Laurel blinked in surprise. "You must be the officer they keep mentioning." Barton nodded, offering a tired smile. "Barton Cribbs, ma'am. I was the one who pulled your boys over. Thought they were trouble." "You weren't wrong," Laurel said with a smirk. He chuckled. "They're good trouble. The kind this world needs more of." He sat for a few moments, unsure how to begin. Then he reached into his bag and handed over a small envelope. "It's not much. Just some money from the officers at the precinct. We heard about your bills and, well, most of us wanted to help." Laurel's lips trembled. "Thank you." He cleared his throat, awkward. "I also came to ask something." Jared and Kane looked up. "There's a community outreach program we've been building. Youth mentorship, police engagement, real, honest stuff, not just PR fluff. It's slow, and we've made mistakes. But people trust you now. If you boys ever want to get involved, we'd be lucky to have you." The twins looked at each other. "I don't know if people trust cops yet," Jared said. "They might," Kane added, "if more acted like you did that night." Barton stood, offering his hand to Laurel. "You have some incredible sons." "I know," she said. "And now the world does too." As he left, Kane walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, traffic moved along peacefully, the city alive and unaware of the miracle that had unfolded in one small room. He didn't feel like a child anymore. Neither did Jared. Something in both of them had shifted, something permanent. They had crossed a line between fear and purpose. And though they didn't yet know what came next, they knew one thing for certain. They weren't just survivors. They were fighters. By the end of the week, the story of Kane and Jared Holloway had become a full-blown media sensation. What started as a local hospital bulletin had exploded into national headlines. News anchors called them teen heroes, while social media flooded with hashtags like #HollowayTwins and #DrivenByLove. People from all over the country were reaching out with donations, letters, and offers of support. But inside the Holloway family, reality was still catching up. Laurel had been moved out of ICU and into a recovery room with a window that overlooked a small garden. The hospital staff treated her like royalty. Some nurses dropped by just to say hi. One intern asked for a photo. Laurel smiled and handled it all with grace, but her focus never drifted far from her sons. On Friday morning, she was sitting upright in bed, a tray of untouched breakfast beside her, when a hospital administrator knocked gently and entered with a wide smile. "Mrs. Holloway, I hope you're feeling well." Laurel nodded. "Getting stronger every day." "Well, you might want to save your energy," the administrator said with a wink. "There's a surprise downstairs. We thought you might like to come see it." Kane and Jared exchanged a look of confusion. 30 minutes later, hospital staff wheeled Laurel through the lobby, her boys flanking her like quiet sentinels. As the elevator doors opened to the ground floor, she gasped. Outside the hospital entrance, a crowd of people had gathered, neighbors, friends, local residents, even strangers. Some held signs that read, "Welcome back, Laurel," and "You raised heroes." Balloons floated above the heads of children. Reporters stood back, cameras respectfully lowered. But the true surprise stood at the curb. It was a brand new SUV, shiny, dark blue, with a giant ribbon tied across the hood. A dealership banner in the background read, "Donated to the Holloway family, for their courage and love." The boys stared in disbelief. A woman from the dealership stepped forward. "We heard what you did. The risk you took. You didn't just save a life, you inspired thousands. This is a gift from our community. And from people who believe the world needs more families like yours." Laurel covered her mouth, tears spilling. Kane turned away for a moment, overcome. Jared blinked hard, refusing to cry in public. Officer Barton Cribb stood near the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets, smiling quietly. He didn't try to take credit. He didn't need to. Later that afternoon, the three of them returned to their small home in the same neighborhood where everything had started. They drove the new SUV slowly, careful, still not quite believing it was real. Inside the house, the familiar smell of old wood and laundry detergent welcomed them. There were stacks of unopened letters on the table, cards from strangers, notes from churches, even a scholarship offer from a local university. "Everything's changing," Kane said as he looked around their living room. Jared nodded. "Yeah. But it's still home." Laurel stood at the doorway, weak but proud, watching her boys with a deep, steady gaze. "You brought me back," she whispered. "You brought us all back." That night, as the three of them sat together on the porch under a sky full of stars, there were no speeches. No reporters. No sirens. Just silence, and peace, and a bond that had survived fire. And somewhere, quietly, the world took notice. Summer came slowly to Mobile, Alabama. The humid air hung low over the streets, and the city seemed to move at half speed under the weight of heat and memory. For the Holloway family, it was the first season in years that didn't begin with dread. No late-night ER visits. No bad news waiting in white envelopes. No silence at the dinner table from a mother too sick to speak. Laurel was walking again, still slow, still with help, but walking. Her doctors called it miraculous. She called it mercy. Each morning she would sit at the kitchen table with a mug of weak coffee and a view of her sons. That alone was enough. Cain had taken to volunteering at the hospital every other weekend. He shadowed the EMTs when he could, learning the names of tools, watching how they stabilized trauma victims. He never told anyone outright, but deep down he knew, this was what he wanted to do with his life. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he had once watched the world try to fall apart, and refused to let it. Jared, meanwhile, had enrolled in a summer pre-college program for biomedical science. It wasn't free, but with the scholarships and donations they'd received, it was possible. He buried himself in textbooks, practicing terms he could barely pronounce a few months ago. Anatomy. Immunosuppressants. Vascular grafts. His goal was clear now. He wanted to become the kind of doctor who had stood in that hallway and said, "We'll do everything we can." One warm Saturday afternoon, the Holloways received an invitation. It was printed on crisp cardstock, adorned with the city seal. Inside were 4 words, "You are being honored." The event was a citywide celebration at the community center. A stage had been set up with rows of folding chairs beneath a white canopy. Local businesses, school leaders, families, all in attendance. Laurel sat in the front row, holding a cane and wearing a navy blue dress. Her eyes never left her son's. The mayor stepped up to the microphone. Some stories remind us that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. That heroes don't always carry badges or degrees. Sometimes, they're just 2 brothers with a mother in danger and no time to waste. He turned to Cain and Jared. "You reminded us what love looks like in action. You reminded us that community is built not just through policy, but through sacrifice." The audience applauded as the boys were called to the stage. Each was handed a framed proclamation, officially recognizing their bravery and service to the city of Mobile. Barton Cribbs, now retired from the force, stood beside them and shook their hands. Afterward, Laurel took the mic, just briefly. "My sons saved my life," she said. "But more than that, they showed me the kind of men they've become. And I couldn't be prouder." The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. That evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, the family sat once again on their front porch. The wind was soft, the air alive with the buzz of summer. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no fear of what tomorrow would bring. Cain leaned back, arms behind his head. "You think things will go back to normal?" Jared shrugged. "I hope not. I don't want normal. I want better." Laurel nodded, watching the sky. "We've already got it." And under that quiet southern twilight, the Holloways, no longer just survivors, no longer just a headline, rested in the simple, extraordinary peace of a second chance. In my view, the ending of this story is not just a conclusion, it's a beginning. It's a reminder that love, when fierce and uncompromising, can drive people to impossible heights. Cain and Jared didn't just save their mother, they challenged a system that often sees young black teens with suspicion before it sees them with compassion. They carried not just a liver in that cooler, but the weight of responsibility, fear, and hope that most adults would buckle under. What moved me most was not the media attention, not the public praise, but the quiet strength this family showed in private, the silent moments in hospital rooms, the long nights on worn-out couches, the way they stood by one another even when the world wasn't watching. This story ends with peace, but not passivity. The Holloways don't return to a simple life, they step into a deeper one, filled with purpose and resilience. And that, to me, is the true miracle, not just survival, but transformation. Their journey is proof that sometimes, when institutions fail, the strongest acts of courage come not from heroes in capes or uniforms, but from children who refuse to let go of the people they love.